I'm honored to introduce Dr. Roy Crabtree. Roy is the Regional Administrator of NOAA Fisheries Southeast Regional Office, where he's been administrator there for the past 17 years, and he's connecting to us this morning from his home in St. Petersburg. Welcome, Roy, and take it away.
Thank you, Keith, and it's good to be with all of you this morning or afternoon, whichever the case may be. Wish we could be doing this in person, but so I'm going to talk some about my perspective on artificial reefs, and the opinions in here are really my own and don't reflect the position of NOAA Fisheries or really anyone else. And I also want to emphasize that this is not an anti-artificial reef presentation at all. I think there are a lot of benefits to artificial reefs, but there are trade-offs that I think often are overlooked, and that we ought to sort of rethink how we think about artificial reefs in a lot of ways. So there are a lot of artificial structures in the Gulf of Mexico, and this talk's not really focused so much on Florida, but it's more of a broader geographic scale, and it is mostly Gulf-centric and a little bit red snapper centric, I guess. But there's a lot of real support for artificial structures, artificial reefs, especially in the northern Gulf of Mexico. And in that area, there aren't many natural reefs, areas like Alabama, where it's mostly sand. And artificial reefs are important to those folks in terms of their fisheries. And in some areas, particularly Florida Panhandle, Alabama, artificial reefs are really the predominant complex habitat type that occurs there. So this is a map that Mandy Kronowska's put together that I've borrowed from her. And you can see that there are a lot of structures in the Gulf of Mexico. And this is, I think, based on reports in 2015, but it undoubtedly underestimates the number of artificial reefs, because there are a lot of private reefs and things and the way it's all lumped together. But you can see in the blue, a lot of oil rig platforms. That number is actually going down as oil rigs are removed over time, and then a lot of the artificial reef structures. And there are a lot of fish on these, and they include some of the most popular recreational species in the Gulf: red snapper, greater amberjack, great triggerfish, and the fishing is great on them, but only when the fisheries open. And that's been one of the problems that we've dealt with, because for all three of those species, we have had pretty extensive closures that have taken place in order to keep the fishery within its ACL, or its annual catch limit. So enhancement means a lot of things to different people. It can sometimes reduce or eliminate user conflicts. I hear that it can move pressure off a natural habitat, and that's perceived to be a good thing. It certainly increases accessibility, because you can provide access much closer to shore for things like red snapper in areas like Alabama and the Panhandle, where they probably wouldn't be much of a fishery for them. It can reduce time and fuel costs, because you don't have to go as far offshore or burn as much gas. And it definitely, they increase catchability. The catch rates are much higher on artificial structures, and that's why people like them. It's good fishing. So it increases the efficiency of the recreational fishery in terms of their ability to catch fish in a given amount of time, as you think about it. I often hear that they increase opportunities, but that, I think there are different ways to look in that, because if it results in shorter seasons and more closures and more regulations, then it's a trade-off there. So fishing pressure in general has been increasing in the Gulf and in the South Atlantic over time. And this are just some trends that only run out to 2015, and there may be some new trends developing in that. But generally speaking, the trend overall has been increases in coastal populations. This is just some detail in Monroe County, where you look at the number of vessel registrations. Again, it's a little out of date, but you can see it's been generally going up. And so the resource demands are generally going up. And what I've observed over the years is that recreational effort is tied into the economy in a lot of ways. When you have a deep recession like we had back in 2009, you tend to see recreational fall off. But when the economy's doing well, it goes up. And when you have these really unique events like the COVID-19, it's anybody's guess exactly what's going on with that. And I don't think we have a clear picture of that yet. But over the last 20 years, generally speaking, the demands are going up. So if you think about access to fisheries and fishing seasons, there are a lot of different components to that. And what I've observed over the last 40 plus years is some dramatic changes in the recreational fishery. And putting all these together, I think it's led to dramatic increases in the fishing power of the recreational fleet. First, the equipment is vastly better today than where it was 40, 50 years ago. Back in the 1960s, a 100 horsepower engine was huge. But over the years, horsepower has gone up. We've gone from two-stroke technology to four-stroke engines. We've gone from wood being the most common boat to fiberglass. And today you'll see the Kevlar 35-foot center consoles with, like the one you see here, 4, 5, I've even seen 6 outboards across the back, 4-stroke engines that are more reliable and burn less fuel. And so the vessels that folks have today are much faster. They're much more capable of going offshore and covering large amounts of water than have been in the past. The other thing that's happened is the technology has changed dramatically. I can remember when I was a kid and first started fishing offshore a little bit back in the 70s, really all you had was a compass, and you might have an old paper bottom finder that was very fussy and hard to get to work. But when we were out of sight of land, we were largely lost in terms of exactly where we are. And over the years, Lorenzi came along and other things, but really the widespread availability of inexpensive global positioning systems that's tremendously changed things. So folks know now exactly where they are on the water. And in terms of depth finders, echo sounders, those kinds of things, I would say that recreational vessels today have access to what 5, 10 years ago would have been state of the art on a research vessel. So amazing equipment, and it's cheap enough that people have it, and it's widespread. And so there's no place to hide for fish anymore. There are very few secret spots. You can buy all the positions of reefs and all the hot fishing spots over the internet and put them on your plotter. And you can also go on to the internet now, YouTube, and you can be instructed on how to fish for just about anything you want. And you can become a great expert. So I would argue that the average recreational fisherman today is a much, much more capable fisherman than 40 years ago, 30 years ago. So the fishing power of the fleet has gone up a lot. And at the same time, we have, over the past few decades, put a lot of artificial reefs out. And the net impact of artificial reefs is they increase catch rates. And in some areas, particularly off of Alabama, for example, the majority of the red snapper that are there are present on artificial reefs. And so we have fisheries where the seasons have gotten short enough to become controversies. We have federal fishery management councils who take actions designed essentially to reduce catch rates, bag limits, and oftentimes minimum size limits are really geared to slow down the rate that fish are being caught in order to keep the season open longer. And so in many cases, on the one hand, we're trying to maximize the season length by slowing the catch rates down. On the other hand, we're deploying more and more artificial reefs, which have the net effect of increasing the catch rate. So we're often working at cross purposes. And so who's paying attention to all of this? And there's not a good answer to that. The permitting agency really is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And you have various groups like BSEE and others that have roles in terms of rigs to reef programs and oil rigs. But really, there's not a permitting agency with authority over this who has fisheries as a key part of their mission. And so we have the councils whose responsibility it is to manage fisheries in federal waters, and they set up their goals and objectives. But there really isn't anyone making sure that the artificial reefs that are being deployed and put out fit into those goals and objectives very well. So I think it's a real gap in the management paradigm now, and I would argue it's a gap in the Magnuson Act, and probably that Congress needs. It's a little like aquaculture right now, in which the permitting agencies don't include anyone whose main mission is managing fisheries. And I think that's a problem, and I hope at some point that will be addressed. So as I said, the councils are charged with managing federal fisheries for the greatest overall benefit of the nation. And included among that is, it says particularly with respect to recreational opportunities. So Mandy Karnauskas, who I think is on a paper with John Walter that's being presented at this symposium. And at any rate, their data has shown that in some cases, the catch rates for red snapper over artificial reefs can be 20 times or more higher relative to natural bottom areas. And so this increased catchability has important trade-offs, and it can compromise other management objectives, particularly if maintaining season length is among your objectives. So we've had short seasons for red snapper, for gray triggerfish, greater amberjack, all species where I would argue the majority of the recreational catch in the Gulf of Mexico is coming off of artificial reefs. And so I think this is something that we need to look at when we think about how many artificial reefs do we need and where do we want to put them. We did just a simple analysis where we looked at how it would affect the season in our projection models if you shifted different amount of effort off of natural bottoms to artificial reefs. And in this particular example, they assumed that the landings rate is 14% over the artificial bottom than the natural bottom. And you can see just relatively small shifts towards artificial reefs can result in pretty substantial reductions in the length of the season. So it does make a big difference, and it is something I believe needs to be taken into account. And when I look at the permitting process the Army Corps goes through with these, it almost never is taken into account. So I'm going to show a little graphic here. I guess you can see my pointer. A few things you'll see here is the length of the season. This is the proportion of the catch that comes occurring in the various states. And then up at the top is the year. And again, these are just crude approximations of a lot of things. And I will readily concede that there are a lot of confounding variables and things that affect this, but let's see if, there it goes. And so at any rate, what you see over time is that artificial reef deployment seems to have gone up in some areas, and where the catch is occurring is shifting. And so this is 2016, where we had a very short federal red snapper season. But what's interesting about it is you look at some of the states, Alabama particularly, And you can look at Florida catches a lot of fish, but most of what's caught in Florida is coming right out of the panhandle. So you've got, and this analysis doesn't include Texas, by the way, but you've got a really small section of the coast that's catching the large proportion of the take of red snapper. And so really, I think partly what's happened is as we deploy out artificial reefs in some areas, we're moving where the fish are being caught around. And I think over time, if you didn't have the artificial reef program off of Alabama, I don't think you would have very many red snapper caught there. You certainly wouldn't be anywhere close to the amazing number of fish caught there now. And so for people in Alabama, yeah, well, no wonder they love having the artificial reefs because it gives them access to the fishery that they might not have very much. But on the other hand, it can lead to some problems. I'm not going to say too much about some of the other species, but you can see over time, even though, for example, red snapper has made amazing progress in rebuilding, the seasons are relatively short compared to where they have been. Now, this has changed some with state management that came along in the last couple of years, and each state now has a different season length. But we've also had shortened seasons for a gray triggerfish and gray amberjack as well. And this just shows how catchability shifts around, and you can see the large amount of fish caught off of Alabama here in, I guess, the kind of mustard color. So we have moved the fishery, so to speak, from where it would historically been. Historically, the fishery would have been off natural bottom areas, and now it's largely off of rigs and artificial reefs. So a lot's continuing to change, particularly with respect to red snapper. We're learning a lot more. But one thing we know is that total egg production on artificial structures is relatively small compared to the overall egg production in the Gulf of Mexico. So while there is a lot of evidence that artificial reefs increase productivity, I think it's a marginal increase. And if you think about it, even if artificial reefs increase the overall productivity of red snapper in the Gulf by 20–25%, which I think is unlikely, if they're increasing the catch rates by 5 to 10 times, the net impact on the season is to make it shorter. Now, I want to take the last couple of minutes of my talk to just talk a minute about the great red snapper count. And probably a lot of you have heard of this. This is a $10 million study led by a whole slew of investigators across the Gulf. And they were tasked with coming up with an absolute estimate of the abundance of red snapper. And the preliminary results of this are out. And I'm hoping that the data will be used in order to provide new science advice to the Gulf Council towards the end of the year, early next year. And the council will then respecify the catch limits based on that. But just in general, what we learned is the study estimates that the population of red snapper is around 3 times larger than the size estimated in recent stock assessments. But it also shows that the vast majority of the population, 70% or so, occurs over what's called uncharacterized bottom. This is low relief bottom, sand, mud, various things. Sometimes we don't know what's there. But most of the fish are in areas that are seldom fished. So it turns out the stock assessment did a really good job of estimating the size of the population on artificial reefs and high profile bottom, but it missed a lot of fish that are out there. So there's going to be a lot coming that the council's going to deal with next year. My guess is that the quotas will go up. We know right now that the exploitation rates on artificial reefs are very high. And if we raise the quotas, they're likely to be even higher. So the question is going to be, how hard can we actually fish the fish on artificial reefs without substantially affecting the red snapper population overall in the Gulf? We know red snapper don't move around a whole lot, so we might be able to fish them very hard. And because we have so many fish in areas that aren't fished very much, it may not have near as big an impact on the population as we thought. So we may have more flexibility and how to deal with this. We may also see localized depletion in a lot of areas where fishermen see that the fishing's not as good as they thought it once would, and this would be something that the states would have to deal with. It's also remember that these are multi-species fisheries, and more effort for red snapper is going to mean more catching of greater amberjack and gray triggerfish. And we know at least like greater amberjack, they move around a good bit more than red snapper does. And so the impacts on greater amberjack may be different. And then the last question I'll pose to leave you with is, if artificial reefs do increase productivity, then how do we account for that kind of bonus production in the context of the Magnuson-Stevens Act? Is it just included in what we have to manage and rebuild to, or can it be sort of treated differently as if these fish were coming from stocking or even aquaculture? And so there are a lot of interesting things there that we need to look at. We need to keep investing. We need to integrate artificial reef decisions into the fishery management process. And we need to make sure that managers and the public understand the trade-offs that are being made when we deploy artificial reefs in very large areas. And I thank all of you for your time.
I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. John Walter. John has been with NOAA Fisheries for the past 13 years and is connecting to us this morning from his home in Miami, Florida. Welcome, John. Take it away.
Thanks, Keith, and thanks to the organizers of the symposium. I'm really happy to be here. Artificial structures and the impacts on fisheries have been a pretty long-standing topic of research for NOAA Fisheries, and so I'm presenting the work of a number of my colleagues who've been addressing this topic. So this is the time series of artificial structures in the northern Gulf of Mexico, showing the buildup of artificial reefs and then oil platforms. Oil platforms in blue showed a substantial buildup during the 1960s and 1990s, a leveling off, and then now with decommissioning of a lot of structures, particularly structures in shallow waters, the number of oil infrastructure is declining. In contrast, artificial structures, artificial reefs that are created largely for the purposes of the fishing community seem to have increased since the 90s and have continued to increase since then. And this time series that you'll see in yellow is something that we'll actually use in integrated modeling within the stock assessment in some results I'll show later throughout the presentation. So again, this is the map of basically the state of the Gulf of Mexico with regards to pipelines, artificial reefs, and natural reefs. There's a lot of natural reefs that have not been mapped. In fact, there's a lot of, as you can see in like the Big Bend area, there are lines of mapped artificial or natural reefs, which are really the ones that have gotten side scan or multi-beam mapping. But in between there are reefs also. So a lot of the reefs are not entirely known. I'll show a slide that shows how we've tried to better incorporate the sediment type information to give predictive maps of what's not known. So the big debate about artificial structures really hinges on a hypothesis about whether they attract fish and thereby concentrate organisms and fishing, providing no net ecological benefits and potentially some negative consequences, or whether they actually produce fish and produce biomass. So the questions about artificial structures and red snapper, and I'll focus on red snapper, not because they're the only fish or organism impacted by artificial structures, but they're the one that has probably the most amount of research devoted to it. And so that we can begin to address these questions in a quantitative framework because we have this body of research. So the things that we know, one, if you build it, the animals will come. And a number of studies have shown that if you put structure in an area that otherwise doesn't have structure, you'll get red snapper, as well as other things. And a very nice before-after control impact study by Matt Strike well illustrates that. The question is, does this pull from natural habitats? So do you just, by putting that there, suck the fish off the natural habitat? That's an unknown. Second thing that we know is that if you build it, the people will come. And in fact, 45% of the commercial catch of red snapper in the Gulf of Mexico comes from artificial structures. For the recreational fishery, it's unknown. However, a substantial component of the recreational fishery does focus on artificial structures. And the question is, can that be used as a management tool? And I'll go into that further as to whether that we could actually promote fishing in certain areas through the use of artificial structures. The third unknown is that artificial structures harbor about 0.15% of the total area of the Gulf of Mexico, but about 13% of the total red snapper are on artificial structures. And this is a study by Mandy Karnauskas. So that's something we know. The question we don't know is, does moving those fish, given that they usually spawn where they are, does that alter overall recruitment because of the oceanography? And I'll go into a study that actually answers that question. The third known is that if it does increase production, there's several mechanisms by which it does that. And I'll go into that in the next slide. The question then remains, does that actually produce fish? How do we account for production if it happens and determine its magnitude? And one of the ways that we do account for production of animals in a management context is within the stock assessment, because that's usually the model that we use to estimate what the benchmarks are by which we manage the population and by which we develop the quotas for management. And lastly, the big question is, how do we manage given what we know and what we don't know? So if it does create production, it can alter three processes. It can make more fish, either through recruitment or through increased settlement. It can make fatter fish in the sense that they can either grow faster or they can be fatter and have higher fecundity, or it can increase survival by providing a refugia, maybe from trawling because you can't trawl across a structure, or perhaps because it actually provides protection from predators. And there's some belief that in fact artificial structures may do that. One of the preferred structures, in fact, for producing some of the volunteer structures we've heard about are old chicken coops, which actually have a mesh size that may be very nice to protect animals from being predated upon. And in fact, in a lot of scientific studies where they've done predator exclusion experiments, they in fact use mesh like that to exclude predators so that small fish or invertebrates can survive underneath them, to evaluate what the impacts of not having predators being able to access them. And each of these three things are explicit parameters in a stock assessment model, which allows one to either test those against data or and then also to estimate the magnitude of that parameter change and to set up specific hypothesis tests of the magnitude and directionality of each one of these three potential mechanisms. In addition, there are also testable mechanisms that we can actually go into the field and often measure many of these specific processes. So if it's attraction, then it alters, and it's attraction solely, then it alters a parameter in the model also called catchability. And that's the fraction of the population captured by a unit of fishing effort. And catchability is a particularly important parameter because it's used to determine whether often the way we measure the abundance of animals is from fishery catch per unit effort or survey catch per unit effort. We set out bottom long lines, or we use cameras or traps or videos, or we take information from recreational commercial fisheries. And so the fraction of the population that's captured when you drop a hook and line down to the bottom is basically determined by the catchability of that gear. And one thing we know is that on artificial structures, the catch rate is about 20 times higher than on natural reefs. So there is definitely increased catchability of fish on those artificial structures. And one way that we can develop a hypothesis test of whether it is attraction or production is that basically what would need to happen here in this image, this is the Alabama Artificial Reef Zone. The spatial shading is the Karnauskas et al. Mapping of red snapper. The red are individual reefs. The blue are known natural reefs. If it is simply attraction, then fish would be moving from the blue onto the red areas, therefore just being pulled from one to the other. If that's happening, then there should be a net increase on artificial and a net decrease on natural over time. And in fact, because of the way that the actual red snapper stock assessment is set up, the data going into it, all of the nymph surveys are primarily focused on natural habitat. So they would then show a decrease if that's happening. And most of the fishery dependent data comes from catch rate data on structures, so they would show an increase. And if that's the case, by putting the vector and the time series of artificial structures in the model, we should be able to partition whether it is entirely attraction, because it should say, oh, they're moving to artificial, moving away from natural. And that's the hypothesis test in a nutshell of simply testing attraction. And so to go into and reiterate some of the things that we know, if you build it, they will come. And this is the Karnauskas et al. Mapping of red snapper spatial distribution, where about 87% of the total population in number is on natural bottom, 13% on man-made. But what you do see in the center right off of the Alabama artificial reef zone is a large concentration of fish. And this, prior to the building of this, the studies that were done of this area found that it was largely and mostly a sand bottom. By putting structures there, we've now put fish there. And so there is a substantial population off of Alabama on these artificial structures. Question then is, does this pull from the natural habitats? And one way that we're beginning to address this is work by Sue Laura Barbieri, who's actually, and a number of other colleagues who've put acoustic transmitters down on specific reef sites of artificial and natural reef to be able to determine what the home ranges of the animals are and what is their probability of moving. But one thing that's probably likely, just from a basic principles, is that it's unlikely that by putting artificial structures in this area off of Alabama that we would have done a net pulling of fish from, like, say, off of Texas and Louisiana. And it's unlikely that that pulling from this distance, based on what we know about the movement of animals, that would have occurred. However, the animals do have a larval life history that where they actually have pelagic eggs and larvae. And so I'll show in another slide how that might have occurred. So the key to answering that question is a concept that I'll invoke called viscosity, or the degree of movement in time. And the work that Sue and other colleagues are able to do, and we can actually empirically measure by tagging animals, is whether fish might get pulled from these blue natural onto this red. And I'll give an example of a high viscosity animal, which is basically high viscosity. We think of motor oil, very viscous, it doesn't move much, would be sea scallops, where they settle where they are. They can move a little bit by clapping their shells, but for the most part, they're stuck where they are. A low viscosity animal would be bluefin tuna, that's here one day, gone the next, and basically could move anywhere. Red snapper are probably somewhere in the middle, but they might be closer to more resident based on a lot of the information that we're beginning to see. And this is, again, a map of what I'll show here. The shaded here, the shading in this one comes from a Krieging interpolation of sediment bottom type, which was done by Ileana Cholet, which actually shows a lot of the reef that's not been mapped yet, but probably exists because that's a high probability of gravel habitat. So there is reef interspersed throughout the AARZ, and there's reef that's not been mapped, as shown in the shading. And so if you build it, the people will come. And this map shows a interpolated density of fishing from VMS, vessel monitoring systems, in the commercial handline fishery, shading going from green to red. And that's overlaid with artificial and natural bottom type. And what you can see is there's a lot of fishing, particularly in the West Florida shelf on natural bottom habitat. That's substantially the red grouper fishery, and to some extent, some snapper fisheries. And then fisheries in the western part of the Gulf of Mexico, there's less fishing pressure here. But you could see that from this, we were able to assign fishing to particular habitat type and say whether the fishing, because if it was within this proximity of a known structure, it was likely on that structure. And then we were able to take about 50% of the total fishing effort, assign it to the catch from a trip, and thereby assign that catch to where it occurred in the commercial handline fishery. The results of that are that overall about 55% of the fishing and this is landings of red snapper in the handline fishery, which is about 90% of the commercial landings, 55% are on natural, 45% on artificial, but that's overall and primarily driven by Florida being mostly on natural, but Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas being more on artificial structures. So we know that these are hotspots for commercial fishing. And I think it's pretty also obvious to anyone who recreationally fishes that the artificial structures are very much hotspots for recreational fishing. So the question about whether moving 6% of the spawning biomass, which is what the Karnauskas study said was on artificial structures. And the map here at the top is the index fecundi without artificial structures. So presumably this would be the distribution of spawning biomass in the absence of artificial structures. When you add them in, you see the effect of the AARZ. And this is the map with structures. And then what we can do is do a model, a connectivity modeling system, which is basically using an oceanographic model to move eggs and larvae around in space. And each one of these blue dots is an egg and larvae that's entrained in the currents. And it's basically a game of musical chairs. Once the music stops, which is your larval duration of about 30 days, the music stops for you. And if you're in somewhere you can settle, you survive. If you're out in the middle of entrained in the loop current and you're a larval snapper, you die because you haven't made it during the time before your larval duration ends. By doing this modeling and modeling millions and millions of particles, we can then estimate what would happen by moving the spawning biomass. And then allow me to explain this figure. This is a figure that shows the source node. This is where the eggs came from, and the receiving node on the x-axis. What it says, if you're on a 1-to-1 on this axis, then you're getting self-recruitment, i.e. spawners from Louisiana would be producing larvae and settlers in Louisiana. Okay. What we did from this one is on the left is just spawning from natural habitats. This is spawning from all reefs, both natural and artificial. Overall, the mean survival rate is exactly the same. So when you use the same spawning biomass in total, but distribute it differently, you get no net change in overall recruitment. Okay, so by moving fish, but creating the AARZ, did we lose or gain recruitment? No, not from this modeling. However, what we did, because of the process of self-recruitment, i.e. you spawn where you are and your eggs eventually do make it back to where they were spawned more often than not because of the substantial 1-to-1 relationship here, you actually get self-recruitment from the AARZ, i.e. the AARZ is making its own eggs and larvae. The other interesting aspect of this is that you see kind of a net west to east shift. So Texas, rather than self-recruiting entirely to Texas, is producing eggs and larvae for Louisiana. So we see some net west to east shift in the larval production. So overall, did that change recruitment? No, but it did locally change recruitment and put recruits where otherwise there would not have been much recruitment. So within the hypothesis that I outlined, again, the attraction versus production, and here's the same plot, but of the Texas-Louisiana shelf. The shading is the Karnauskas saw red snapper. Blue is no natural reefs. Red is mostly oil infrastructure, showing that the fish are not always on this oil infrastructure and not always on artificial reefs. There seems to be substantial biomass out in other types of habitat, which actually it's this undifferentiated habitat that if you've been paying attention to the great red snapper count, which was where a substantial fraction of the population actually was determined to occur from that. And then within the stock assessment, the assessment currently estimates that recruitment now is about 40% higher than it was historically. We don't exactly know why. We don't know if it's because of the presence of artificial structures or if it's something else in the system or an artifact within the model. But what I specifically did was I linked recruitment, growth, von Bertalanffy K, or the growth parameter, and age zero mortality to that index of artificial reefs to determine which was a better fit to the data. And the results, I won't go into the full results, but basically there was no systematic trend between the fishery independent and fishery dependent indices, indicative solely of attraction. So we failed to reject the simple change in catchability, which suggests that other factors related to production might actually be more plausible given the data. The model favors an increase in recruitment over time, increase in recruitment deviations, and as well as a change in growth, where fish seem to be growing. Increase in growth also could be explained by the data in the model, but not a change in age zero natural mortality. The magnitude of the increase in recruitment, 70% in CDR 31, 46% in CDR 52, was, however, not consistent with the small fraction of the population on artificial structures. Remember, there's only 13% of the total population on artificial structures, which would be unlikely to have a 46% increase in recruitment. So there's got to be other factors in play. Now, I'll just give some caveats that this model is not it's an imperfect hypothesis testing tool. It doesn't yet use all of the data, and there's very likely that interactions occur between these different factors. And as we go into the red snapper research track assessment that's going to try to be more spatially explicit and specifically account for more of these processes, we may gain even further insights. So question 2, and this is an intriguing management question about whether we can use artificial structures as promoted fishing areas. It's basically the inverse of MPAs. A lot of management has been focused on trying to protect areas with the view that those would improve management. And it's been hard to really say that marine protected areas do have a net management benefit, and that's quite contentious. However, if we could shift human behavior to particular areas where we want them to fish for various reasons and avoid other areas, we might be able to achieve some net benefits. And in fact, the red snapper is kind of a good example of we have basically been doing that, in the sense that a large part of the area is not fished very heavily. Certain local areas are fished very heavily. And so on the bottom is the red snapper spatial distribution for Karnauskas. The contours are VMS fishing effort, which shows that there's a substantial body of the population that's just not getting much commercial fishing effort. This off Louisiana is 100 miles offshore. It's unlikely that people are going to be running all that far to go catch a few red snapper. And in fact, the fishery itself is fishing in other areas. So those fish are not getting the same exploitation rate that they are on artificial structures. And we know that artificial structures are getting pretty high exploitation rate from a series of studies. And this is a work by Lisa Carlton, who used an index removal experiment to be able to estimate the exploitation rate. Basically, you do a survey before the fishery. You have a 9-day fishery, you know what gets removed. You assume closure, and then you do a catch rate afterwards. And because in the difference in either catch rate or the difference in the ratio of legal to sublegal fish, you can then estimate the exploitation rate and the abundance that was there. And what Lise found was that on the artificial reef, and particularly the Alabama artificial reef zone, exploitation rates in 2011 and 2014 were as high as 50%, which is almost double the exploitation rate in just the Eastern Gulf, and almost 4 times the exploitation rate for the Gulf of Mexico as a whole, which is suggesting that we are fishing very heavily on certain areas, but not fishing very heavily on others. And so the rest of the population may be serving as the de facto protected area, and the artificial reef zone in Alabama as the de facto promoted fishing area. And perhaps that's would be able to keep enough biomass for spawning out in the water while being able to achieve an area that's, one, efficient to fish because it's easy to find, as well as having the benefit of perhaps allowing longer seasons, greater exploitation rates locally. And this is something that I know that my colleague Roy Crabtree has gone into in his presentation, and this is a slide I borrowed from his about the red snapper season length as a function of artificial reefs and the proportion of landings from different areas, where Alabama actually has about 38% of the total recreational landings, and they're likely to be coming from that artificial reef zone. And if that's where a lot of the fishing is coming from, if those high exploitation rates locally have minimal effect on the population as a whole, perhaps that might be a possibility to use something like that. And the exploitation rate means that the catch rate would go down, so that the progress towards a certain quota would actually, you'd be able to fish longer. And so it might be that that's kind of a management policy that might work to achieve the benefits that society wants out of the red snapper fishery. So to revisit the questions, does pulling from natural habitat, creating these artificial structures pull from natural habitats? It's still unknown, but unlikely from a Gulf-wide scale. Can we use these as promoted fishing areas? Likely we already are. And I think that the way to answer that would be a more explicit source sink dynamic modeling that would basically be able to say, how much can we fish out a particular area before it's replenished by adjacent areas? And because we're inverting the MPA, where most of the area is MPA and a small area is promoted fishing area, that completely changes the dynamic of a lot of the modeling that's been done on MPAs, where you had a very small MPA and a very large fished area. We have the inverse, and it might change the dynamics, and I think we need to explore that. Then does moving spawning biomass alter recruitment? Yes, because of the local reproduction. Red snapper over to here, if they spawn here, the modeling suggests you get recruits there. And so do artificial structures produce fish? Yes, and likely through the local larval supply, possibly through growth, possibly through some component of survival. And right now, the magnitude of that is still be determined. And that's something that we will try to determine within an integrated stock assessment model. So given that, how do we manage? And I'll note that the great red snapper count is going to benefit all of these kind of questions and provide a substantial amount of further clarity to the unknowns. So under National Standard 1, MSY, or maximum sustainable yield, is the largest long-term catch under prevailing ecological environmental conditions. It's re-estimated as required by changes in long-term environment or ecological conditions, fishery technology characteristics, or new scientific information. In other words, it may not always be constant. We usually assume stationarity, but we've been doing that, and a lot of our assessments go back as red snapper to the 1880s. It's unlikely that the environment has been stationary or constant throughout that whole time period. And we may be needing to consider time-varying MSY or time-varying productivity. However, it's contentious because when does one invoke it? What's the burden of proof? It often probably requires mechanistic studies to be able to say, yes, fish growth has changed. Because growth has changed, we need to allow MSY to change. Sometimes it's estimable inside models, but one of the key issues is also to understand the covariant factors that also occur at the same time. And I'll use the example here of Pacific salmon to illustrate that. If in fact the productivity is solely due to something that is anthropogenic, but it could be positive or negative. Remember, if we think artificial structures have been a net positive, we also have to invoke the same situation that other anthropogenic interventions could be net negatives, in which case, do we change the productivity because of that? And that's why it's such a slippery slope. But a good example about in the West Coast, they've done substantial hatcheries for Pacific salmon, where they've put in millions and millions of salmon into the water to benefit the population, presumably, particularly benefits the fishery. The question is, does it also benefit the population? How do you deal with it? And it was believed that the Pacific salmon hatcheries were increasing the carrying capacity of salmon because they were seeing an increase in carrying capacity. There was also an increase actually in the carrying capacity of the environment at the same time. So it was a covariant factor. If you simply said that, oh, carrying capacity is increased because of what we did, it's a correlation rather than simply causation. And that's where being able to correctly attribute it, it turned out that oceanographic changes occurred that made the ocean more productive. And at the same time, the hatcheries were operating. And it's still an open question whether hatcheries are actually a net benefit. In general, it's probably more likely to be a negative for the population that exists, but it's a benefit for the fisheries that are occurring and having these other population to fish on. So the other key aspect is what happens when an ecosystem is in net zero mass energy balance, which is the basic fundamental assumption when doing any ecosystem modeling, which means that if you take energy from here, you have to give energy from here. If you produce a lot of red snapper here, what have you taken from to produce them? Because the net energy balance has to balance out. And so there are clear winners and losers. Perhaps red snapper is a winner. Perhaps the losers are the soft bottom benthic critters that existed prior to the AARZ. And so from a societal perspective, we have to consider that there are going to be net winners and losers to wholesale anthropogenic changes to a system. And I think one thing that we're beginning as we move into some more next generation strategies for managing populations that don't require stationarity of this assumption that the environment is stationary, is that we move to management procedures that allow for dynamic productivity. And things like the great red snapper count, where you actually are counting the number of fish there, and you could say, okay, let's only take a certain percentage of what's there, provide us the opportunity to really change the game in how we manage. And it might, in fact, be something that we can explore in the future that allows us to deal with the fact that nature is going to give us curveballs and it's going to change. So in conclusion, there is model and empirical evidence that doesn't favor simply attraction. There is some element of production. The magnitude's unknown, but it may be estimable within the integrated models. But red snapper is only one species, and I focused on it because we had the most data, but there's many other species. In particular, there are good ones and there are bad ones. Lionfish being one that's may not be one we want on the reefs, but it seems to have a particular affinity to artificial structures. We have other animals, gag grouper amberjack, that have very lower viscosity, and in fact, they have very strong ontogenic movements in gag grouper and fairly rapid movements in amberjack, whereas if you build a structure, the amberjack on natural reefs will immediately move to it. And so in that sense, you've got very different movement dynamics. And then there's protected species that also have to be considered, in particular sea turtles, marine mammals, and many other creatures, particularly as well as corals. And so artificial structures probably are best considered as a tool to manage humans, not necessarily to manage living marine resources, particularly because we don't know all of the impacts that are going to occur, and we're scratching the surface. We may have a decent idea for red snapper, but we're scratching the surface on many of the others. We do know how it's going to affect humans. Okay, with that, I'll thank the data providers, analysts, and contributors to the many CDARs, and the upcoming research track assessment, the organizers of the summit, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much for that presentation, John. And I'd like to introduce myself one final time. I'm Ana Sangronis, the Florida Sea Grant Extension Agent here in Miami-Dade County. And we'd like to go ahead and invite all of our panelists, the final presenters of the day, to turn their cameras on and their microphones on as well. And if you could, for the rest of the participants, if you could remain on mute with your cameras off, that would be much appreciated. We're in the very final session of the afternoon, so we want to thank you all for hanging in there. And we've already had some great questions coming into the chat box, so please continue to communicate those through there. And I'm going to turn it over to my co-moderator, John Keenan from FWC.
Yes, thank you. It's been a great meeting, a great summit, great session. We're going to wrap things up with an excellent panel discussion. We have some time to take a breath and answer some of these questions. I would like to go through and introduce panelists to everyone that's out there participating. Dr. Bill Lindbergh from University of Florida, Dr. Ed Camp from University of Florida, Drs. John Walter and Mandy Karnauskas from NOAA Southeast Fisheries Science Center, Keith Milley from FWC in Tallahassee, Dr. Roy Crabtree from NOAA Southeast Regional Office, Trip Aukman from CCA, Dr. Will Patterson from University of Florida, and Tom Twyford from the West Palm Beach Fishing Club. So we have a lot of people, a lot of experience to ask questions of and to delve down into some of the deeper big picture type questions. So we do have a lot of questions. Anna and I are going to be working through some of these. There's also the steering committee that has been accumulating questions to ask as well. Before we jump into general panel type discussions, I would like to bring up some of the questions that were posted specifically to Dr. Crabtree and Dr. Walter in the last couple presentations. So one was from Brooke Shipley regarding the oil platforms in the Western Gulf of Mexico. Definitely one of the most interesting components of artificial structures in the Gulf. When I was there, the number was in the 4,000s, and now it's much different. So Dr. Crabtree, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the general effects of what we think is going to be happening with the large scale removal of these.
Well, they are being removed slowly over time. Some of them go into a rigs to reef kind of program and they're just toppled over, but probably more of them are just coming out of the water. So the net effect of that would be to slow down the catch rates. And you know, if you're someone who has a favorite platform that you're used to fishing on and it's removed, you're going to have to move somewhere else to fish. But by and large, we are continuing to deploy other types of artificial reefs. And I know places like Louisiana, Texas have artificial reef programs. So we may be making up for some of the loss by putting other types of materials out. So that on balance, I mean, the catch rates are really high on rigs. And so lower catch rates would likely lead to longer seasons in the states where there were rigs, mostly it's Western Gulf. But I don't think it would have an appreciable impact on the overall recovery of the stock because the majority of the population is elsewhere.
And I'd invite any of the panelists if they'd like to comment on that as well.
I'll just, Tom Twyford here. I'll just add that, you know, I think there's a lot of opportunity to innovate different types of artificial reef structures that help fill that void if a lot of the rigs are coming out of the water. It's so costly to kind of recycle and repurpose those rigs. I mean, at least we've looked into it on this end. It's, you know, the transportation and cleaning costs and all of the logistics involved. I mean, they're great structures, obviously, but so I just, you know, that's what kind of prompted our Reef Dart program here in Palm Beach County, is trying to innovate something that hasn't been done before and create habitat in really deep water for maybe some of these overfished species of snapper and grouper. And hopefully with the intent of trying to create some new aggregation sites. And so I think there's just tremendous opportunity for innovation. And so just my 2 cents there.
Excellent, thank you. Anna, did you have one of the questions that you'd like to key up for us, or?
Yeah, sure do. Thanks, Sean. This came in just after Dr. Crabtree's presentation from Brooke, and she was really curious about the maps that you used on page 2 of your presentation and regarding what the source of the art structures were. If it was the BSEE platforms, are they showing the historic total and not the current total?
Well, I think that figure would be more historic because one, that figure was prepared several years ago. And to be honest with you, I borrowed it from another paper, so I'd have to go back and look to see what the basis of it is. So it's all very approximate, and none of it's up to date or current.
Excellent, thank you very much.
I do think a couple of questions have come up regarding the preferred fishing areas concept of artificial reefs as kind of the opposite of marine protected areas. And there was a question, are there any concerns about the consequences of these, be it angler interactions, large predator attraction, assuming that the thinking is that the benefits far outweigh the ecological or social costs in the case. John, would you like to touch on that a little bit? Consequences of the preferred fishing areas versus protected areas. Muted somehow.
Yeah. John, maybe we can work with you to fix your audio settings, and perhaps Dr. Karnauskas can comment on this particular question.
Oh, she's muted also.
I think, folks, if you go to the lower left corner where your microphone is, there's a little up arrow caret. And if you click on that, it should let you get into your audio settings and choose your source. It looks like you might be having the same issue.
Well, I'll make a comment on it while they're trying to figure out how to talk. One way that I could see how that might work was when we have a closure for a species like red snapper, you might be able to have some exceptions to the closure. So rather than having it closed Gulf-wide or off of the state in its entirety, you might leave certain artificial reef zones open and allow the fishing to continue there. There are concerns about the consequences. One, they're multi-species fisheries, and the more effort you have out there, they're not going to just be catching red snapper, they're going to be catching other things. So it could lead to some overfishing concerns for things like greater amberjack. And then I think you would see really high exploitation rates. And so fishermen might see a decline in the quality of the fishery in terms of catch rates and the size fish they're getting. So that would see something that the states and the councils would have to figure out a way to balance.
Great, thank you, Roy.
Add either Dr. Kanauskis or Dr. Walter?
Looks like they're still working through those glitches. I think we can perhaps circle back to get that question covered by them. In the meantime, going back to that idea of the PFAs, Bill Horn had a question asking if an increase in artificial reefs results in more anglers, would less artificial reefs result in less anglers? And perhaps you could examine the drop in rigs to determine this.
The floor is open.
I would say that it would give, I mean, in that instance, it gives more anglers opportunity. If you're an angler that has a number of natural areas, as we do here in Florida, from the Big Bend down to the Keys, I think those areas just gives more opportunity for more anglers that are just getting into the fishery to get out and find fish. But it can create less opportunities, I guess, for, as Dr. Crabtree was saying, for keeper fish as you move forward.
Yeah, I'd like to add on that. I think that Tripp makes some good points, which is when you have changes in structure, we don't know how that is going to affect fishing effort, because fishing effort is a function of how many folks are actually fishing and then how often each of those folks go. And so, especially when we're dealing with offshore fishing, there are non-negligible capital investments in the capacity to do that. So we're not exactly sure what will happen if people get into fishery, perhaps motivated by something like artificial reefs in part, and then that structure changes. One of the things that we suspect would happen from other fisheries is that we'll see target switching behavior first, switching to either other reef fish or other semi-reef fish, pelagics, AJs, covias, et cetera, or going all the way pelagic. So we expect that might go on, but I'm not personally aware, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I'm not personally aware of really recent studies looking at that specifically with artificial reefs. Then the other questions we either basically need to investigate from natural experiment, from looking at what's happening, or we do discrete choice surveys to try to understand how people say that they would behave, which is a pretty imperfect prediction of what people will do, but it's the best we can do absent manipulative experiments here.
I just wanted to offer a suggestion, since it seems that Drs. Walter and Karnauskas are having trouble still. Maybe they can type their responses into the chat box, and I'd be happy to read that out loud as an alternative.
I'm on the phone now. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, great.
Great.
Great. Do you remember the question we were asking a few minutes ago?
I think those last responses were pretty comprehensive, so I don't have anything to add. Thanks.
All right. Well, Sean, I have another question. Oh,
Yep, no, go ahead.
Mike McAllister was asking to John and or Roy, he is curious to know, since the Gulf of Mexico is very different than the Atlantic and much more data deficient, how might you expect to see the answers or hypotheses to these questions change in the South Atlantic, particularly given the closer proximity of both artificial structures and natural habitats to shore? In other words, easier access for user groups.
Well, it is a very different place, the South Atlantic. I don't know about the Gulf being more data deficient. I would say in general, that's not the case. The real difference I see between the two areas is, one, you have much lower productivity overall in the South Atlantic. So the yields coming out of the fisheries are much lower. Some areas, the structures are close to shore, but that's not true everywhere. You get off of Georgia and South Carolina, you have to go quite a ways out. I don't believe we have anything comparable to the Alabama reef zone, where we have such a large area that's had so much artificial reef deployment. And of course, we don't have oil rigs, but we do have very short seasons on the South Atlantic, and we're experiencing with red snapper. I think the recreational season this year was 4 or 5 days. And the complaint I mostly hear over there is that we've overpopulated the ecosystem with red snapper. So it doesn't seem a problem that it's hard to catch the fish. The problem is the seasons are very short. So I don't know if more artificial reefs really help the situation over there, because it's not that we need better fishing. It's just that people want more access to it. There may be problems with the scale of the assessments. We may have underestimated productivity or population sizes in the South Atlantic. That seems to be the case with red snapper in the Gulf, but there'll have to be more research done over there to figure that out. But you know, the productivity of red snapper in the Gulf, the quotas are somewhere in the order of 13, 14 million pounds. And in the South Atlantic, you're talking hundreds of thousands of pounds. So it's much, much smaller fishery.
Well, this was brought up in a prior session, and I kind of like to circle back to it. In 2017, there was a large amount of money put forth toward developing extensive amounts of artificial reef areas in the Florida Panhandle. Dr. Lindbergh, you brought that up in one of the questions for our monitoring efforts. I kind of would like to put it to the group of, is this a kind of method, or will it become a Alabama artificial reef Eastern component? And if so, how is that projected to change fish populations? Since, as Dr. Lindbergh, you pointed out, fish do move. So does anybody would like to comment on that, please?
Well, Sean, along with that question and related to the concept of a PFA, you know, how sensitive would the PFA concept be to the viscosity and life history strategies? And given the multi-species nature in some of these regions, you know, could it really work for red snapper, but then be a detriment to gag, given the differences in how they behave with respect to their habitat? Too bad John's still having trouble, because he alluded to both of those things in his closing slides.
I think John's trying to connect by phone if he's. No, I see lips moving. We're going to get this figured out, John.
All right, am I unmuted now?
Oh, there you are.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. What a challenge. Anyway, thanks for the great questions, and I'm glad to be here in person. Yeah, I think Bill hit it right on the head, is that it might work well for something like red snapper, but it might have some negative consequences for something that gets attracted to the highest preferred habitat. And amberjack and gag are kind of examples of where they seem to have a particularly preferred habitat and they aggregate to them. So would you then be putting them in greater danger of fishing mortality by doing that rather than where they normally are? So that's kind of the considering it from a multi-species aspect, I think, is where we need to think about what the potential impacts are. Thanks.
Dr. Patterson, you've worked off of Alabama and its artificial reef zone for many years, as well as the Florida Panhandle. Can you comment on the expansion of the artificial reef areas in the Panhandle?
Well, the artificial reef zones have definitely increased in number, and the number of reefs deployed have increased over the past decade or so in the Panhandle, but it still pales in comparison as far as the artificial reef density in that region off Northwest Florida relative to Alabama. My estimates of number of reefs off Alabama are actually higher than what was shown today in a couple of presentations. Regardless, they're much higher density than other places. As far as this, preferred fishing area and focusing effort there, clearly there's trade-offs, and I think it's important for the audience, especially the various user groups, to just remember that higher catch rates can equal higher productivity, but they don't necessarily equal higher productivity. So if you have stocks that have low viscosity, high self-recruitment, like some of the estimates that John Walter was showing earlier from their modeling of red snapper, then that might be a case where, the local dynamics are being supported by the fish there on those structures, and the source sink dynamics are much simpler. But if you have fish that move around like ag quite a bit, or fish that don't move hardly at all, except in ontogenetic stages like ag, then the dynamics are much different. So I just think it's important to remember at the base of this that productivity, that enhanced catch rates can mean enhanced productivity, but in many cases they're not coupled that way. That you're causing some other difference in the dynamics of the fishery that's not coupled to biological productivity per se.
Thank you. That's given me a lot of other things to think about for asking the group. One of the big questions that we have is, in order to guide local and state artificial reef managers, what is it going to take to have a more strategic approach, to have more specific objectives that we can pass on to managers in order to not just handle artificial or red snapper populations, but to take this on in a broader context, as well as providing these opportunities to the stakeholders?
Well, if you look at the way fishery management is structured, it's the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council by and large, which has the representatives on the states on board, and they do the fishery management plans. The gap I see is they have no direct authority over artificial reefs, and they aren't involved in the permitting. That's the Army Corps of Engineers by and large. And so I think there's a real gap in terms of the management framework, because there's no one entity in charge of coordinating the program over a region-wide basis like the Gulf of Mexico. And so you end up with every different state doing their own thing and no real coordinated thought behind it all. And so to me, we ought to have some legislation. If we're going to regard artificial reefs as a fishery management tool, then it seems to me they ought to come under the authority that's in charge of managing the fishery. And I think that's a problem.
Hey, just to follow up with what Roy was saying there, it seems to me that, different states have different approaches. It's handled at the state level as far as building artificial reefs. But most of the programs are focused on the engineering and persistence of structure versus the implications on the biology. And the managers and even the assessment scientists or the scientists that are feeding data into the assessments, the thing that they're having to on the back end, they're dealing with the consequences of artificial reef construction. And without, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's true, the dynamics have been affected for various fisheries, and we don't always know how. And so we have shifts, like John pointed out, this 40% estimated increase in red snapper recruitment over the past few decades. There could be other reasons for that, but if it's due to artificial reef deployment, we don't have a way to tease that out because we didn't do controlled experiments to understand the dynamics, the biological, ecological function of the artificial reefs. It's been a frustration among some folks that these large scale, NERDA or RESTORE projects focused on artificial reef construction have had so little science built into them. We've missed a golden opportunity when we put $13 million worth of artificial reefs on the bottom of the Gulf without having the ability to actually do controlled experiments to understand, if we put reefs in a certain area, do we draw red snapper or gag or amberjack or gray triggerfish from natural bottom? How do we affect the movement dynamics of those species? How do we affect the recruitment dynamics of those species? But anyway, so oftentimes we're flying blind. We see a change or we perceive a change and there's a correlation to a time series of artificial reef deployment, or in the Western Gulf, even artificial reef removal. But we don't have the basic ecological data to really say, okay, this is the driving process that's causing these changes. Managers, therefore, have a lot of unknowns in that respect.
And I think in Florida, we are, Will, we are striving to try to make that connection between the managers and the stock assessment, folks like yourselves. 2017 at the AFS meeting was really, I think, the first time where we've had, presentations from John and others to kind of inch towards that. And I really commend the steering committee for helping us put today's program together. But as many of you have pointed out, at the local level, and Tom and Tripp can probably attest to this too. They are building projects that are responding to the requests from their local stakeholders, mostly the recreational angling community. So I think what we need to do is have an input for the researchers and the stock assessment folks, to try to feed into that. So on the construction side of things, it's the bus isn't being driven by the stakeholder initiatives alone, but that there's an opportunity for the management agencies to weigh in as well.
Yeah, Keith, I think that symposium in 2017 was a really key moment because of the presentations that were there and a lot of the sincere efforts to try to capture the stock dynamics that may be affected by artificial reefs. And obviously, Mandy's paper that came out earlier that year, and then some other work that's come out since, has started to fill in some of those gaps. One thing that was presented at that symposium was a talk by Clay Porch, in which he talked about the difference between maximum economic yield and maximum sustainable yield. And I think one thing that if these sort of preferred fishing areas and the source sink dynamics of that, if that moves forward, that could be an opportunity to really do management on a spatial scale that perhaps tries to maximize economic yield, the recreational fishery, while at the same time doesn't have a negative effect on the sustainability of the stock overall. So if you manage the stock overall for maximum sustainable yield and above the minimum size stock size threshold, but within that zone, you can get maximum economic yield, then that might be a way to actually address both sides of that management issue and do it in a sound way.
I just wanted to chime in. I would caution everybody a little bit on painting a broad brush that all of these artificial reefs are being created just for fishing and obviously diving. But you know, what we're trying to do here in Palm Beach County with these innovative reefs we're putting out in 500 feet of water is our primary goal is not to create fishing sites. That's a side benefit, but our primary goal is to increase substrate and high vertical profile marine habitat that hopefully enhances you know, stocks of overfish, snapper, and grouper. We don't have a lot of that kind of deep water habitat off of Palm Beach County. And so when we launched this initiative, this Reef Dart initiative, our number one goal was to create habitat almost like a de facto marine refuge. Current, depth are all limiting factors on the efficacy of somebody's fishing trip out there. Granted, technology with electric reels and all kinds of sophisticated electronics has improved recreational anglers' ability to target deep water species. But again, I'll go back to my earlier comment about engineering innovative reef designs that kind of help manage the exploitation of the sites. And so, I mean, we think there's a great deal of potential, and a lot of this is unknown, obviously, to really enhance deep water habitat for these fish that need it most, things like Warsaw grouper, snowy grouper, stuff like that. And we're already seeing it on this site. And I would also say that, and I'm not familiar with a lot of the programs in the Gulf, but we're trying to connect those dots between the angling community and the scientific community. At our Reef Dart sites, we've been putting acoustic receivers at these sites. We have an acoustic release receiver on our 500-foot site. We haven't popped it yet. It's only been out there about 6 months. It's about time to do it if we get a weather window. But we just, off of our Palm Beach line, our acoustic receivers that includes our shallow Reef Dart site, we had 435 detections. We had a cobia from Pensacola. We had 2 sawfish. So we're doing things to try and connect the scientific, you know, the monitoring data and hopefully, you know, reveal some things about these sites that maybe we didn't know. But I wouldn't just paint all artificial reefs as just exclusively for fishing. That's not what we're trying to do here. It's a side benefit. We actually think maybe even it'll help pelagic fishing, and maybe one day we create special management zones for some of these deep water sites where bottom fishing at these depths is prohibited, but the design of the structure actually enhances interactions with pelagic fish like blackfin tuna and sailfish and stuff like that. So just saying, it's not just for fishing.
Yes, and I certainly agree with that. And I think from many of the presentations that we've seen over the past, 3 days, from, what it was in the 80s to now, the diversity of putting reefs in areas where, anglers aren't going to be able to access, or using reefs as methods for transplanting, corals that have been, harvested and grown in labs, to encouraging people and children to learn diving by going down and seeing underwater art. So it's definitely broadened the use and utility of what we're deploying out there from 8 million tires. So the hindsight for sure is an improving perspective. I think what the challenge is, and especially for this panel, is where should, right now, especially speaking of Florida, should the state of Florida go in respect to artificial reef development over the next 5 to 10 years? Continue.
Yeah, and then obviously that falls squarely on my shoulders. And this summit is one way that we inch towards that. Internally, we've been talking. We were originally supposed to have this in-person event in April. We're glad the program remained intact so we can be virtual. We were hoping that 2020 would bring us into the a strategic planning phase. Clearly, we've primed the pump with this program, and I expect that in 2021 we'll be able to look more strategically at Florida's artificial reef program. Also thinking of Roy's comments as he's walking away. NOAA has the National Artificial Reef Plan, originally written in 1985, updated in 2005, and Roy, you're absolutely correct that the regulatory federal Army Corps process focuses primarily on pollution, water quality, and navigational interests. So I think there is an opportunity and perhaps a need for more higher level federal input into the perhaps a revisit to the National Artificial Reef Plan, and we would do that together with the Atlantic and Gulf States Artificial Reef Committee on the Marine Fisheries Commission. Perhaps in 2021, when we reconvene with our Atlantic and Gulf States commissions, we'll be able to make strides towards some of these strategic initiatives.
Well, Keith, along with thinking about the process by which a more strategic approach could occur, given that the reef projects, the reef programs are implemented and executed at a very local level, oftentimes without the benefit of the scientific advice that we're seeing reflected in the some of the presentations today. Could there be a very intentional, almost hierarchical planning in which the councils at the federal level provide some guidance to the commission, at the state level provide some guidance, but then regional types of workshops and planning processes that help to ferret out what kinds of strategies might work for the ecological and economic conditions of each of Florida's regions. I'm just thinking, we have to engage the end users, and we have to engage all the participants in the summit, but we need to bring a very high level of scientific advice and policy decision-making into that discussion. And it was a watershed event in 2017 to have the NOAA fisheries actively engaged in some of these discussions. So maybe we've turned a corner there. I'd like to be optimistic and think that's going to be happening over the next couple of years.
I sure hope so. And, clearly the most influence that we have is in our funding mechanisms. My program administers federal funds from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but as well as those NERDA funds that Will Patterson mentioned. Of course, those had specific boundaries associated with that. But I think, one way to get towards that, Bill, is to revise our grant, program to incorporate more of these scientific considerations in our planning.
I think with the recent analyses that Mandy did, Dr. Karnauskas and Dr. Walter, who left a minute ago, I know some of the work that Ed Camp is doing about effort and choice, all of those things, these models, in many cases, parameters have to be assumed because there are no data. And that has implications on what the fit is. So I think we're at a point here where programs like yours, Keith, could actually look at the models and figure out, okay, where are the gaps? Where are the holes that we could address with empirical data and studies? I think there are actually some studies that haven't been published yet that could fill in some of the stuff that John was talking about earlier. But it's a case now when communication is key, because then RFPs can be structured such that you're targeting questions to be addressed that can help fill in critical needs for more effective modeling, which has feedback then into the management loop.
And just to build on that, in Ed's talk yesterday, he noted that the modeling approach could also be adapted to, a gaming environment for helping stakeholders understand, what's going into the decision-making process, and more stakeholder engagement. I know it's worked in other contexts, and it might work well for artificial reefs.
I really like where this conversation is going, and I'd like to build on it as well. I think a lot of the things that have been touched on, the small spatial scales at which the different agencies plan the project. I think we all have a little bit of our blinders on. Each of our agencies have specific management objectives, and I think to really go forward, what we need to do is look at all the diverse objectives that are out there. As Tom mentioned, it can be really wide-ranging, everything from fishing to education to creating habitat. Get an understanding for what all the end goals are of all the diverse user groups, and then using these models and the data that we have, build this conceptual understanding of the feedbacks and the trade-offs that are being made, so that each individual agency, when they go to put in a reef or manage a fishery, do whatever they do, they look at the impact that action has on the entire system, on all the trade-offs and the feedbacks that are in the system, and how that's meeting everyone's end goals. I think having either a qualitative or a quantitative understanding of how it's all pieced together with those end goals in mind is kind of what's needed. And as Roy mentioned, legislation would be great, but short of that, I think just greater collaboration, such as what we're seeing now in conversations in that direction, would get us in the right direction.
And yeah, thanks for that, Mandy. And I think there's opportunity for us to, continue to build the perception on artificial reefs, and maybe, as Bill Lindbergh shared in his opening remarks, bring some philosophy to the table, where we're not trying to compartmentalize things as much as I think we do. And it's just that word artificial alone. Sometimes when we talk with different funding entities, especially on the restoration side, if you bring up the question of, well, a man-made habitat, it's almost like that, another realm for them. But in reality, we are building these habitats that is part of the natural system. And, maybe bring us back to Bill Seaman's starting comments that got us going this morning. At what point do these structures start performing and truly become natural? Because sometimes that word artificial is a turnoff to those habitat restoration folks that I think could be valuable to include in this discussion and help us embrace the work that we're trying to do.
An added challenge to that, at least in the Florida, way that it's set up, is that we're on a local level with the county managers and the county and the city user groups. They are the experts on the reefs that are in their backyard. Figuring out a way of having that line of discussion, of communication between whoever entity is going to make some of these large decisions and pass on the interconnectedness. How do we get back to the local user groups and then make that connection? I think Keith's group is excellently placed in order to have some of that pathway. We just have to keep working at it.
Well, Keith, since you brought up my colleague's comment this morning about when does it cease being artificial, that also comes from a perspective of the entity of the reef, or, you know, if you think of the conceptual space I introduced yesterday morning, you know, if we're looking at the natural as versus artificial as to, you know, the composition of the community, you know, mimicking what we see in a long established natural reef system, you know, that could take, depending on what you're looking at, quite a bit of time. But if you're looking at the ecological processes, you know, the artificial reefs are simply tweaking or manipulating the ecological processes that are ongoing within the system. And it's by, in my view at least, understanding those ecological processes that we can anticipate what the outcome might be. And so, again, that's where the modeling comes in, because it integrates those processes in a way that we can, you know, get an objective handle on it.
I just want to give everybody that we have about 5 minutes left for this last session before we go to our final remarks of the day.
So to follow up quick on what Bill said, I completely agree, but it isn't just the ecological processes, which, you know, he's clear on too. It's these socioeconomic ones. And this is something that I've been thinking about for the last, 45 minutes or so, with respect to the preferred fishing areas, not performance fishing areas. I think it's really critical that we try to anticipate how anglers will respond once these might be set up, because what we've seen in the research is there is at least the strong possibility that artificial structures increase catchability in some spatial realm. And there's also the possibility that artificial structures may actually decrease catchability a little bit on the other direction at a different scale, meaning if they stick anglers to them, if the anglers are lured to these structures and they keep fishing them and they leave the other fish alone, then potentially you're looking at, instead of hyperstability, you have hyperdepletion, which is a really different scenario for the fish stock. And so it's really interesting to kind of play the game and say, okay, well, what if we assume something like red snapper doesn't move too much, and so we have these artificial reefs put in here and fishers go to these artificial reefs? Well, what's going to happen is that the stock should get depleted relatively quickly if they're not moving too much, because they're not actually serving as a massive sink. And so then the question is, where do those anglers go next, and how satisfied are they? Those questions are critical to answer if we're trying to look at the overall effect of something like a preferred fishing area on the SPR, as well as on the MEY, which I thought Will was very astute to bring up. You know, if we are actually interested in trying to manage recreational fisheries for the maximum economic yield, in this case, it isn't necessarily harvest, it's really value, it's really satisfaction. And so I do think that we really want to do probably a pretty good job in the next 3 to 5 years of sorting out how we think these things are going to work, and then implement them and be honest with everyone, especially the stakeholders, saying, we're not exactly sure what's going to happen. Please work with us and let us do this as an experiment. Let's try to get good data on it and let's find out. Because if the potential exists to be able to extend fishing seasons and at least give people an option, even if it's not the best fishing in the world, that might be a huge increase in the value to the rec fishing industry. But we want to try to anticipate some of these unintended consequences before we go make a lot of wide-scale semi-permanent habitat alterations. We can't erase the numbers off of people's machines, and we can't easily remove the reefs once they've been put in. So I think those things really have to be sorted out. And I do very much hear Tom and other people's astute comments of it's not all about fishing, and that's for sure true. I guess my perspective is it's the recreational fishing, and specifically the reef fish recreational fishing angle, where we stand to do some of the most potential unintended damage with reefs. And so that's why the focus is there, not because that's the only thing that they're important for, but because it's a place where we could really shoot ourselves in the foot with stakeholder support if we advertise these things and then it backfires, especially in management agencies.
Thank you, Ed. Panelists, I hate to say we have to keep an eye on the clock. I would like to give the opportunity for can we go around the board for anyone to give some final thoughts, a minute or two on your thoughts on where we should continue this effort in the future?
I'll just go back to what he was saying with the carrying on with the artificial reefs. I mean, I know that the people that I work with, all of my members, they really enjoy seeing the artificial reefs go in. They really enjoy diving them later to see the fish that it brings in. And if we have to take some of these and just use them as just fish non-fishing areas and start to build the fisheries back up, I think what Tom was saying, that's a great idea. But I would like to move forward in the coming years with Keith and others and try to put more habitat out there for the fish and for us.
I'll just say congrats to another strong symposium, Artificial Reef Symposium. Florida's been a leader in artificial reef science, not just management implications, but trying to fund and think about the biological and ecological consequences and potentially even negative fisheries consequences of artificial reef deployment. And I think getting folks together, challenging assumptions, talking about ideas is always a good thing. And so I just congratulate you folks who organized this. And I'm sure there'll be many more to come in the out years.
And I'd like to simply echo what Will just shared. Outstanding program, and really, for me, reflected a very strong stewardship ethic, that was identified back in 2005, FWC and Sea Grant, and all the stakeholders have truly been living up to it in the way they've engaged in these conversations. So thank you.
I'd also like to congratulate the organizers on a job really well done. I know it's been really challenging with the virtual framework, but it's been really great to hear all the talks and participate. Just one final thought to touch on what Ed said. He made a good point. It's not only about the biology and the ecology, but also the social and economic aspects. And I don't know how many social scientists we have on the line. I'm certainly not a social scientist, although I work with them. And, when you start to dig into, what is angler satisfaction, you start to discover that humans are just as complex as the fish, and that there's a lot of diverse perspectives and a lot of different types of satisfaction and measures for satisfaction out there. And I think that working with social scientists to get a handle on, what people want to see as outcomes of fishery management would be really important as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mandy. Before we wrap this last section up and turn it back over to Angela and Keith, I want to thank Sean for doing such a great job at really managing the questions. I know there was quite a lot of interest in this conversation and did a great job. And before everybody, pops off, just hang in there for a few more minutes. And one last final bit of housekeeping. Angela is going to place a link into the chat box, and that's to the electronic evaluation. And we would very much appreciate if you all took a few minutes to fill this out. Please give all feedback, procedural, content, everything. We really value your input. This was the first time we've ever had to do something like this. And so we want to know what worked and what didn't. And if that's not enough, Angela and my job and all of the other UF faculty that are part of the steering committee will get fired if you don't fill it out. So there's your dose of daily guilt for you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you to the panelists.
Were Keith and Angela going to come back on for our...
Yeah, did you want to hop on, Angela, for our final...
There she is.
Final farewell.
Hi. Yeah, thanks everybody so much for being here. I think Keith has some very eloquent closing remarks that he has already compiled. So I'm going to just let him talk.
I don't know how eloquent we are, but yeah, if we have Tom and Will and Ed close your video, then it'll be just Angela and I to close, kind of bring us back full circle to kind of how we started.
Bring the whole steering committee back.
Oh yeah. If the steering committee wants to hop in there as I'm talking, I just thought I would start our closing by going through the numbers And, you know, touching on the fact that we'll start with, we had 2 co-chairs, myself and Angela. We had 14 member steering committee. We had 17 posters, 39 speakers, and we had, oh, I have my other screen here. Here we go. 233 attendees, which is a record. We've never had over 200 before. And then we've been broadcasting this live, plus all the future online viewers. I think we are going to really have a very strong outreach from the program today. So, you know, during the Hindsight is 2020 session, we look back over 50 years. Then in the regional updates, we look back over the past 5 years. And then the remainder of the program we spent and we built up to this discussion about really, you know, focusing on the future. So I feel that we really achieved our the theme and the goal of this summit. You know, we received talks on the latest construction and design techniques. We had new technologies for mapping and monitoring. We saw some of the latest research capturing data on fish, but also, and maybe as we've learned from some of the last talks, you know, capturing data about the people using the reefs. And we see some very impressive modeling efforts, I think, that are cutting edge and are really going to help launch us into the future and better work together with each other and the stakeholders. And so it's very exciting to see the engagement with our federal and state partners, especially, you know, we appreciate the participation from NOAA Fisheries on the stock assessment side of things. So I guess as a reminder, all of these presentations and the discussions, as you see in the top left box, have been recorded. Feed loop will stay up for 1 year. And all of these will be posted on the Florida Sea Grant Artificial Reef webpage, where you can click on workshops and summits and see not only this, but also all the prior ones as well. And behind Angela and I are screen grabs from over the last 3 days. This has been the you know, environment that we've lived in, and I appreciate everyone working with us through the technology. And I'll pass it to Angela to cover anything that I missed too. Oh, sponsors. I probably forgot about the sponsors.
That's all. I was just going to say thank you so much to all of our speakers, all of our panelists, all of our poster presenters, and all of our sponsors, and of course, all of you guys who are here. Huge shout out to our steering committee. Thanks for doing this for 2 years. And remember that your feed loop site that you've been in for the past 3 days, that's going to be open for you to access for the next year. So you can go back and listen to any of those recordings. You can check out the exhibit hall where all of our sponsors are. You can download posters. You can continue to upload PDFs or relevant links into the sessions that you think they might be well received. So it can continue to be a resource for you for the next year. And then also everything will, you know, obviously be archived on the Florida Sea Grant website as well. So it will live in perpetuity for all time. So thanks so much for your presence and patience during the whole summit. And we'll see you in 5 years.
Thank you, everyone. I wish we could do a group hug or something. But...
I know. Oh, wait, and please fill out the survey. It's in the chat box here, but it's also a link in the Feed Loop site. So those surveys are important for future planning of future events. So go ahead and fill them out and give us your feedback, good and bad. They are anonymous. Thanks again.
Thank you, everyone.
Are you volunteering to lead this again in 5 years?
Don't speak all at once.
It's way too soon to ask.
Your mic's off, Keith.
Bye, everyone. Stay safe, healthy, and hopefully we'll see all of you offshore.
Been doing it so long, it's hard to leave.